So at this point, we have the basic foundation of our game. We have our foreground, background, and our spawner is now creating objects, and as they move off the screen, they're getting destroyed. Now with a game this simple, we wouldn't really worry about performance. But, being forward-thinking, we wouldn't want to be creating all these kind of instances and then destroying them and having to create them again. That actually incurs overhead. What we'd want to do is something called object pooling, where each one of these objects gets created and then it doesn't get fully destroyed, it simply gets recycled, reconfigured, and used again. Now before we can actually implement our object pooling system, we're going to want to route the creation and destruction of game objects through a single point in our game. In this case, we're going to create a GameObject utility that'll help us manage that. Inside of our scripts folder, let's create a new script, and we're going to call this GameObject util. Then let's open this up in MonoDevelop. Now our utility is going to be accessible throughout our game. In fact, it's not going to even be attached to a GameObject. In order to do this first, let's actually remove the MonoBehavior extension. We actually don't need to extend MonoBehavior. We also won't need the start and update methods. At this point, we just have a simple C# class. Now, for other classes to access the methods on this class, we're going to create static methods. We've been using static methods throughout the game so far, you just may not have noticed. Generally, a static method is called when you use the full name of the class and then access its method. So let's create our first static method. Here we'll use public static, and we're going to return a type GameObject, and the name of this method is going to be instantiate. We're also going to pass it in a reference to the GameObject we want to instantiate, so we'll need a type of GameObject. We'll call this prefab, and we'll need a vector 3 representing where in the game scene we actually want to instantiate this. Now, since we're not extending MonoBehavior, we no longer have access to the instantiate method. We're going to use the GameObject's own static method for instantiating. Let's set up a container variable that'll store the reference of the instance we create. Here we'll start with a type of GameObject, call this instance, and we'll set this to null. Later on, when we're going through and instantiating objects, we're going to have to decide whether we use an instance that already exists from the object pool or if we create our own. But for now, we'll just leave this here so that we have a way of referencing this variable before we return it at the end of our method. Now let's set the instance to equal our GameObject static method of instantiating the prefab itself. Then once we have the instance, we're going to change the transform position on it to equal the position we pass into the method. And finally, we're going to return a reference to the instance itself. This way, once we create an instance, we can use it in other places of our code. The last thing we're going to want to do is create a destroy method. We'll do the same type of public static method, except we're not going to return anything when we destroy an object, and we'll call this destroy. Here, we're also going to pass in a GameObject, and this will be the instance we want our utility to destroy. And finally, we'll use the GameObject class's own static destroy method to do this. So now we have a single place in our game where we can control the creation and destruction of objects in the game. In order to make this work, we're going to have to go back through two of our other classes that instantiate and destroy objects. Here, we'll start with a spawner, and here where we're already calling instantiate, let's simply add the GameObject utility in front of it. Now when you hit period, this close to another method, it's going to want to create, MonoDevelop is going to want to autocomplete. Just simply hit escape to exit out of this menu so we don't get two versions of instantiate. Also, since we're not going to be handling the rotation, since we know in our game nothing gets rotated, and we only pass two values into our instantiate method, let's remove this last line of code. So now we create a random prefab, and we simply pass in the position. The GameObject utility takes care of everything else. Let's save our script and move on to destroy off screen. If we scroll down to out of bounds, we're going to do the same thing here where we call destroy. Here we'll just simply use GameObject util, making sure to hit escape so mono-develop doesn't autocomplete for us, and we'll save the script. Now, let's go back into Unity, and we're going to run the game. Now that we're rerunning the game, we should still see that objects get instantiated and that objects get destroyed, as everything is now running through our GameObject utility. In the next video, we're going to talk about how we actually can start recycling objects instead of destroying them completely.